probably neither Frédéric nor Dipesh need introductions, but I do have formal introductions for both of you, and then we can turn to your discussion. So as you know, Dipesh Chakrabarty is Lawrence A. Kimpton Distinguished Service Professor of History, South Asian Language and Civilization at the University of Chicago. I did look up on his website, and number of publications, invited professorships, editorships is an immense list. So I'll just mention a couple of things. His most recent book is The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, which is forthcoming with the University of Chicago Press. He has many other books, but the one I should mention in particular is his Provincializing Europe, Postcolonial Thought and Historical Difference, which was published in 2000 by Princeton University Press. This book has been translated into several languages. I should also mention that Professor Chakrabarty has been a visiting professor at the École Normale, where he spent time with Frédéric Worms. So I'll turn to Frédéric Worms now. Frédéric Worms, obviously, as all of us know, is the world's leading scholar in Bergson. He's currently the director of the École Normale, and he's the founder of the Société des Amis de Bergson. He too has many publications, too many to list, but just a few I'll mention. There's a great benefit to us that he completed Philippe Soule's biography of Bergson, and he's a principal editor of the French critical edition of Bergson's work. Among his own books, I'd like to emphasize La philosophie en France au XXe siècle moment, which is just a great book, pour un humanisme vital, which is in 2019. And his most recent book is Face à l'événement, which has just been published, if I understood things correctly. Okay, then the title that Frédéric and Dipesh has decided for this morning is History of Life and Vital Dilemmas, a Global and Bergsonian Discussion. So I'll hand it over to Dipesh and Frédéric.
Thanks, Len.
Thank you, Len.
Maybe I can say just a word to tell you how we decided to proceed, Dipesh and I, on this opening session of this conference. I'm very happy to join you, and it's a major event, of course, for all of us. I'm very glad of this opportunity, and we decided to present our talks as a discussion. And Dipesh will start stating his view on what I summed up as a history of life, but also conducing to vital dilemmas today. I mean, dilemmas for these living beings that we are. And I will respond involving, as you might guess, a reading of Bergson and implying also a discussion of the present time. So the way we want to proceed is this way. And I don't know how much time we have altogether. If you can tell me again, Len.
You have 2 hours. You have plenty of time.
Long time, yeah. Okay.
Okay, so maybe Dipesh will talk. I will respond. We can have a second round of discussion together,
sure.
And then, of course, open it to the whole group.
Okay. Thank you, Frédéric. Good to see you again. And thank you, Len, for inviting me. This is a tremendous privilege because I'm the most ignorant person in this whole gathering about Bergson in particular. So I'm really here to learn, and in many ways I wish that Professor Susan Gerlach's paper on the planetary, which is coming at the end of the conference, had already been presented. I would have been very interested. Well, I am very interested in hearing what she has to say, but am I audible? Is this volume all right?
It's very good.
Okay, good. Thank you. So let me introduce myself and my work a bit, because I don't expect you to know about my work, and also the connections, how this conversation, which is really part of an ongoing conversation that I've been having with Frédéric on issues of shared interest. And his conversations and some of his writings have made it clear to me that I should have been reading more work. So while I was working on my last book that Len you mentioned. but anyway, to just bring you all into sort of the picture that I'm trying to draw. So I've been by training a historian of colonialism, imperialism. Probably I would be seen as a post-colonial thinker or a post-colonial historian. And really the assumptions about the human with which I worked in history, and most historians do work in history, and particularly humanist histories, is to look on the human as we find ourselves, as individuated entities, as individual human beings who are born, who die, and who have a capacity, as Gadamer says in Truth and Method, in discussing Ranka and destroying his historiography, as he says that history writing is based on the assumption that we have a shared capacity for understanding emotions of the past, because the assumption is that we have a continuity of human experience across time. So if I say to you that somebody in the past got angry, I don't have to explain to you what getting angry means, because that's a capacity that you involve. So I mean, these are evolved human capacities which we take for granted. But that was the view of the human, and therefore the human was the bearer of life and death, the possibility of life and death, the individual human, as well as to life, to the degree that historians would think about it, would be in that shape, that the life of an individual human and the capacities of the individual human and the death of that person. And within that, there were questions of empire, capitalism, eventually globalization, inequality, all the rights, welfare, but all of those histories assumed that the individual human was the bearer not only of life and death, but also of rights, and as well as they were the recipient of welfare. So that was the assumption on which I proceed. I wrote my histories as do most of my colleagues. And that assumption for me was challenged when the news of anthropogenic climate change became kind of general news in the media. I mean, and that didn't happen until, I would say, until the early 2000s. Even though scientists have been talking about anthropogenic global warming for at least 50 years. And it was 1988 when James Hansen, the American godfather of the science of climate change, told the US government about global warming happening. 1988 and 1989 was when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, was set up. And they've been producing their assessment reports. And these reports were really not noticed much, but either people who wrote on globalization or historians, so much so that, when in 2000, the American Historical Review asked a well-known historian from Harvard, Charles Meyer, to sum up the 20th century. And he published a very interesting article called Consigning the 20th Century to History. And if you go to that article, there's not a word about climate change. Whereas by the time Christopher Bailey, who's another very well-known historian, his book on the second volume of his Making of the Modern World was published in 2015 posthumously, it actually did have a chapter on climate change. And I think what had changed for most of us in the humanities and social sciences was the fact that after the IPCC published their fourth assessment report, around 2007, they deliberately made sure that their report got more media publicity so that the issue gained a kind of urgency in the general public sphere. And we all became aware of it. And serendipitously, I became aware of the issue of climate change around 2003 through some events in Australia that I witnessed. very big fires. And as I began to read up on climate change and read up on anthropogenic climate change, global warming, the historian in me was blown away by what the scientists were saying about human beings. Here I was, somebody who had grown up thinking about rights, thinking about individual human beings. I grew up in a period when 60s, 70s, when history was being democratized, and we talked about history of women, history of peasants, history of marginal people, history of indigenous people. And the English word that became very popular in history writing was agency. Agency of peasants, agency of women. And what you meant by agency really was a Lockean kind of understanding of the person, that the person is autonomous, they make their own decisions, they act in their own interests. So when you talked about giving agency to women or giving voice to women in history writing, or peasants or subaltern people, subordinated people, you had this idea of agents as this autonomous, proactive, not just a reactive personhood, a kind of entity that acted in the world. But these scientists were talking about human beings, thanks to their numbers, their technology, the number of animals that human beings kept to eat or farm or whatever, had now become a geophysical agent or a geological agent, or sometimes they say a geological force. So the claim was that human beings were now capable of changing the climate of the whole planet. And a geophysicist colleague of mine, David Archer, came out with a book called The Long Thaw, the subtitle of which said, how humans have already changed the climate of this planet, the climate of the Earth, for the next 100,000 years. So they were actually comparing, they were actually saying that climate change was only part of a family of problems, which included species extinction, loss of biodiversity, food insecurity, the crisis of freshwater supply, that all of these problems taken together, and all of them, they were of anthropogenic origins, all of these problems could mean that life, and now I use life in the sense in which the word life is sometimes used in evolutionary biology or in Darwinian narratives of life. So which is not, I'm not talking about life in this individuated forms in which we think of life, but life almost as a metaphysical category. The use of the word life, which allows you to say that life on this planet has seen 5 great extinctions. So the use that you make of the word in that expression, the life, scientists are saying, and they're still saying, that we might actually now see a 6th great extinction. We may very well be in the beginning, in the early phase of it, but which will kind of accentuate in the next 300 to 600 years. And if that means there will be 2 things, there will be 2 things that's novel about it. This will be the first time that a biological species, Homo sapiens, will be causing a great extinction of life. Again, not just Homo sapiens alone, but with the technology, with the reach that our existence has now. And secondly, it would mean that we would be comparable. We would be comparable in our impact on the planet. We would be comparable to an asteroid strike, right? The kind of force that wiped up the dinosaurs. So we have become that kind of a force. And here the word force is used with all the Newtonian meaning you can put into it. And I was immediately struck by the problem that as individual forms of life, with this capacity to experience the world, this is one form of collective experience we can't actually experience, collective existence. We can't actually experience because it's an existence like if climate change worsens and let's say we all wiped out or most humans are wiped out, the impact of our having been here will continue beyond our existence. So in that sense, we will have an existence even beyond our physical existence. And I realized that this is a form of existence to which we have no phenomenological access. And it's a form of existence that's much more, to understand it, you have to understand Earth system science. Earth system science is basically a fallout of the Cold War, and began with explorations of Mars, and with American interest in actually making Mars habitable, which actually gave rise to the question for scientists, not for biologists, as to whether if Mars was once inhabited. And what does it mean for a planet to be friendly to life? And then all these thoughts, as I explored them in the last 10 years, led me to make a distinction between the globe and the planet, which is actually where my conversation with Frédéric in Paris picked up, because I had just finished my paper on a paper I published last year called The Planet, an Emergent Humanist Category. So that, in other words, there are 3 or 4 things I want to say about the planet before I finish and hand over to Frédéric. So the globe, I realized, what we call the globe. So I've been playing around with 3, 4 categories in my head. One is the world and Earth as very Heideggerian categories. The globe as a more Carl Schmitt type of category, nomos of the Earth. And the planet, which is many people have been thinking about the planet, but I have my own take on it. So it is also a category that I'm trying to create for myself as a humanist historian. I mean, in other words, I'm reading Earth system science to see what I can take from it to address, in some ways, the challenge of humanities type thinking in the world we inhabit. So the globe, I argue, and following Carl Schmitt and Hannah Arendt to some degree, the globe is a human construction. So globe is basically the history of 500 years of European expansion, the rise of capitalism, the Europeans seizing other people's lands, settler colonialism, but basically the fabrication of technology of all kinds that actually connects this sphere into a globe for humans. And that a geologist from Duke University, Peter Haff, actually argues that you have to now think of, apart from atmosphere lithosphere, you have to think of a thin film on the planet that he calls the technosphere, which is all the technological connectivity that connects us. And his argument is that, and it connects back to the question of life, his argument is that we can sustain 7 billion or 8 billion, 9 billion people only because we are technologically connected. If you completely withdrew technology from human societies, in other words, if you took away the connectivity, his calculations are that human population will collapse to 11 million. So his argument, therefore, is that technology has become the precondition for biology. In other words, it is thanks to technology that so many lives and so much life is actually sustained. So I realized that if the globe is a human construction, the story of the globe has humans as its protagonist. You can't tell the separate humans from the story of the globe. And the idea of sustainability that's been around particularly since the 1980s, but it's an older concept going back to German thought, at least of 18th century. But the idea of sustainability is a very human-centric idea. It's really how humans would leave this planet for other humans in a habitable state. The core idea of the planet is habitability. Habitability means, how does the planet remain habitable to multicellular complex forms of life? That has been for the last 500 million years from the time of Cambrian explosion of life. So the story of the habitability of the planet, how the planet became life-friendly, decenters humans. And the simple example of that, the most simple example, is the atmosphere, on which we are critically dependent, which we breathe in, breathe out. This atmosphere maintains oxygen. It's currently 21%, but it has maintained oxygen at a level where it's never been so high that all the forests are burnt up, and never been so low that animal life has choked to death. And I was amazed to learn that the atmosphere has done this for about 400 million years. So paleontologists and geologists call it the modern atmosphere of the planet. And this atmosphere, and if you think about it, oxygen is a very reactive gas. And it goes back to some discussion of thermodynamics that Frédéric has in his book on vital humanism. Oxygen is a very reactive gas. So oxygen quickly mixes up with other gases. If you have to maintain oxygen at a certain share of the atmosphere, you have to supply the atmosphere with fresh oxygen all the time. And who does it? Humans don't do it. Plants do it. Planktons do it. Viruses do, bacteria do it. So if, for instance, global warming goes so far that the seas get very, very hot for planktons, that would kind of need something like a 6 degrees Celsius rise in sea temperature, the planktons would die. If the planktons died, we would be shutting off a large part of the supply of this oxygen. So think about it then, that this modern oxygen, this modern atmosphere, we all depend on for our life as individual lives. It's not surprising or accidental that the coronavirus often begins with respiratory problems. That goes back to the evolution of lungs and what kind of creatures we are, and our relationship to the atmosphere. But if you think about it, the atmosphere was not made with humans in view, but humans are critically dependent on it. So I actually argue that while the globe is a political entity because we created it, almost in a Vico-like fashion, we can say that we created this globe, we understand it, we fight over it. The globe actually gives rise to forms, formal kind of thinking. So you can actually look at the globe and ask, is this a proper democracy? Because you have an ideal form of democracy. I mean, in America today, we've been talking about protecting American democracy, and we can only say that because we have an ideal form that comes out of political thought of democracy. We at least know ideally what it should mean. The planet has no ideal form. And unlike, and I go back to Heidegger's category, where Heidegger says, we not only world this earth, he also says the earth greets us, that there's a kind of mutuality between us and the earth. So he says, when I go to a tree, it is as though the earth is greeting me by rising as the sap of the tree and being available to me as the fruit. Now, he also says that the relationship between humans and the earth is one of strife, because sometimes, as you know, he talks about equipmental breakdown, and we have problems. But at the same time, there's this sense of mutuality. And my argument is that there is no sense of mutuality between the planet and humans. You don't want to face the planet. I'll end by saying why we face the planet, but there is this lack of mutuality. And when we face the planet in all its fury, the planet reduces us to being a creature like any other creature on this earth. And my example of that were the firestorms that happened in Australia, end of last year and the beginning of this year, where, as you know, Australian government decided to kill, or cull, as the word goes, 10,000 feral camels. Do you know why? Because of the fires, the camels were competing with humans for water. So when you actually face the planet in all its planetary fury, you are not the human being that Gadamer talks about in Truth and Method. You are actually competing with the camel. You are like the camel. You just have more technology. You have helicopters and guns, so you can go and shoot them. But why do we encounter the planet? We encounter the planet because we have intensified the global. So if you look at the last several decades since the Second World War, it's the period that now Earth system scientists and historians call the period of great acceleration. It's a period of great acceleration because everything just goes up very fast. So human beings, human population on the planet was about 1 billion, 1.5 or 6 at 1900. So if Homo sapiens have been around for 300,000 years, it took us 300,000 years to get to the number 1 billion. By the end of the 20th century, we were 6 billion. So we grew almost 6 times. Everything goes up. And you know why we grew so fast? Because of access to cheap and plentiful energy in the form of fossil fuel. So fossil fuel enabled us to produce more bodies, to sustain more bodies, and it has two results. At one end, it produced us as a differentiated humanity, mass poverty, famines in many parts of the world. At another end, it produced us as this dominant species complex. Anthony Fauci, whose head Steve Bannon was calling for, actually published an essay. I shared a piece with Frédéric that I recently wrote on the pandemic. He published an essay with his colleague David Morans just September this year, arguing, many people have argued, on people who work on infectious diseases, that we are entering an era of pandemicity, an era of pandemics, because of the way we are destroying forests. There are other reasons too, but forest destruction is a major, because we are making wildlife lose their habitat and come close to us. In the last 20 years, 70% of emergent infectious diseases have come from wildlife, zoonotic diseases. So in some ways, we encounter the planetary and encounter crisis of life in that metaphysical sense, because our individuated lives have proliferated. And human beings have lived so well as they never have in the past, in the last 150 years. We really have lived it up. And now I end by, for this time, I'll end and hand it over to Frédéric. But so the question, the dilemma I find, and Frédéric and I have been discussing this, is that we only have ourselves in these individuated lives to think about what to do, to take responsibility, to argue about it, to disagree on what we might do. And that's where Frédéric's thoughts on vital humanism I found were very powerful and very helpful. And that's where probably Bergson is in my thinking, or should be. But at the same time, the problem is that we are facing problems that outscale us in many ways. We are facing forms of existence that are not accessible to human experience, as we talk about it. So being a geological force is like living with the knowledge that there are electromagnetic waves all around you, but as humans, we don't feel them. So we know them cognitively. We know that we have this existence, but we are outscaled, and at the same time, the human desires also are tied to human scales. So I'll end by giving you this example of air conditioning sales I was telling Frédéric about in India, particularly Delhi. Poor people, the cities are becoming very hot. So poor people are buying air conditioners, relatively poor people. Even so, air conditioning sales are actually going up because of the first unit purchase. Indian air conditioners are based on older technology, so they're very bad for the air outside. But India bargained very hard in 2016 when all the nations of the world got together in Rwanda to discuss the problem of air conditioning. India bargained very hard to be allowed to be among the third ring of countries that would be the slowest to adopt the change in technology, because the more technologically advanced air conditioners are more expensive and required more skilled labor to install them. So they would not be affordable for the ordinary. And it's very clear, the statistics on air conditioning shows that air conditioning actually saves individual lives. But it is doing so in Delhi at the expense of the future inhabitants of Delhi. Because the result is that the Delhi is actually getting even hotter. And this is the dilemma I face, that we have only ourselves as individual humans to appeal to speak to argue with. But we have another mode of existence in which we are impacting on, in which we, in that different we, are impacting on other forms of life. if we foul up the atmosphere, it's not just a case for justice between humans, it's a case for justice between humans and non-humans. Animals need this atmosphere, plants need this atmosphere. So, and as I did political thought, I don't think there is any way we have figured out as to how to address those issues of justice. So, Frédéric has in his book, in some of the letters, he discusses Hans Jonas and the question of responsibility, particularly in the letters to do with climate change in his book. And I think those are obviously thoughts we have to go to. So I'll end here for the time being and maybe let Frédéric come in with his thoughts, which I always learn from and gain from. Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Dipesh, and I'm very grateful, of course, to have this opportunity to discuss your questions and your thought in this context also of global Bergsonism project, and to try and build, I think, what is our main discussion frame for the future together. Of course, I think we are all very grateful because, of course, there is no better way to open global Bergsonism reflection in a public conference like this than to confront the thought, your thought, the thought of global historian. I will go back to what it means today. One of the major thinkers of global and planet and life today was that of Bergson and our common problems. So what I will do is very briefly, I want to sketch a sort of, to sum up what your approach that you just magnificently detailed, and you went through all our major questions. And I will try and show that, that the approach of Bergson, mainly in the two sources of morality and religion, takes the problem by the other way around. And then I will get to what I propose to be a common ground and maybe a personal proposition. And of course, I will deal mostly with Bergson's two sources of morality and religion, rather than the evolution créatrice. But of course, it will be connected. In the title I suggested for the discussion, the history of life and vital dilemmas. Of course, brings back to your thought, but also to Bergson's, of course, because as we all remember here as Bergsonian readers, the first sentence of the Evolution Créatrice, the first words of the Evolution Créatrice, is not the evolution of life. It's not life, it's not the evolution of life, it's the history of the evolution of life. It's the first word. The history of the evolution of life has shown us how human intelligence came out of the living evolution on Earth. So Bergson asserts that evolution is history, and between life, evolution, and history, there is no separation. So this could be also a very interesting epistemological debate on what the question of history of life brings together, the question of, but I will go back to that in a moment, of what we once reserved to the humans, the concept of history, as opposed to evolution. And Bergson and yourself, in a way, are bridging the gap between evolution as an empirical biological fact and history as a spiritual and political fact. And of course, how do we bridge this gap, the gap between evolution and history? This is, of course, one of the major questions today. Of course, you are one of the main bridgers there between the concept of history and evolution, and the fact that we can bring human history together with natural history, as was said in the 18th century, without sacrificing the specificities of either. So that's very important, of course. But I'm already into the topic. So what I want to do is briefly, and you will say when you answer if you agree, briefly try to sum up what you just did, and then show how Bergson does the same, meets the same problem, but the other way around. And I will try and show that, in fact, he is more Chakrabartian than you are Bergsonian, and we can be well. I will try to show that in a way, and I will try to show how how in a way I personally, but very modestly, I need both of you in a way and we need, I think, to have this discussion today. So I will not be very long because we have all to participate, of course. So what Dipesh does, of course, in his progression, I think it's as we just heard, it's a way to go from the global history, both to what Dipesh now calls planetary history, and to the question of human action and life today, and or life today in general, but human action also. So in a way, it's a double extension that we are witnessing in Dipesh work. From the global history, as I understand it, the global history is mostly, I would say, you said it's a construction, it's mostly political. You say it's the history, the world history as a political history. And the concept of global history was meant to go beyond national histories, and to show that the history of mankind is intertwined, and that we have to do a sort of, precisely in terms of scale, we have an instrument there that allowed the human mind to understand that human history is global in a way. That you can't understand, for example, slavery as a local phenomenon. You have to understand it in a global way. You can't understand colonialism as a short-term, locally sufficient phenomenon, but it's a global phenomenon. As we say in France, I don't know if you use this word in your epistemology, we also speak of transnational, of course, transnational history.
Of course, we do, yes.
And so it's both in time and space. It's a change of scale.
Yeah.
And that was the first step of Dipesh's works. And I will try to see, it's the last step of Bergson's book. So you will see what I mean in a moment. And of course, the readers of the two sources of morality and religion know what I mean by that. So then you went to what you call planetary history. And planetary history, it's not the globe, it's what you just recalled. And I just want to be quite pedagogic in a way to have the elements of the discussion. Planetary history is really integrating human history into the history of life, as was just said. And this is in a way the question, of course, you meet today is how do you still do global history and planetary history? I mean, how does the political, economical, social history of mankind act on the planetary balance and the history of life in general? But the first gesture is to put back human political history in the broader frame of history of life. What connects us to life in general, to the millions of years spanning life in general, what we have in common, what we share with all this longer history. And of course, this is major to an understanding of human history as such. And it would be very interesting to confront this with the Evolution Créatrice scheme in the beginning, 1 century ago or so. But I want to go very quickly to the two sources, so I will be very short. And the third element, of course, and we heard that in the end of Dipesh's presentation, is that the third element is that you don't do the history of life, I mean, for the sake of knowledges only. You do it for the sake of action today. So the two faces of life today is a broad retrospection on history of evolution, as Bergson puts it, and also a perception of the emergency of the present through the acceleration speed. And so one of the things we discussed with Dipesh is how history of life can be a tool for the awareness in the action of human beings today. The way we are concretely connected to the history of life should be a motive to act on against the destruction of life today. And how do you connect the knowledge of the history of life with the action of the human beings today on life itself. So that's a major ethical and political point of view. And of course, I think Dipesh, we discussed that the other day, preparing for this discussion, is that there is a sort of phenomenological and rationalist declaration, in a way, that if we enlarge our point of view on ourselves, we will act differently. We will see things differently. And so this is, of course, very, very critical and very important. And so there is this feeling that the global is not enough. There is more than the global. And there is this enlargement to life as a global as a more than global planetary history and action today. And so this is a major, of course, a major step. And the pandemics, as you said, is a sort of confirmation in the emergency itself. And so how does Bergson proceed in a way, in the two sources of morality and religion? And in a way, it's very striking to me because he writes it in a time of political crisis. He's not writing in a time of sort of biological crisis, a sort of crisis emerging from a natural resource in the 1930s. So it's a book published in 1932, of course. And the question is more, how do we resist war, and how do we resist the closed societies in human politics, and so it's not a biological problem that first-handedly Bergson will be facing in the two sources, but still, of course, as the readers know, I think Bergson is of course starting with what you end with. And that's what I want to discuss, of course, today. Bergson is starting with where Dipesh ends up, that is, the concrete connection between human morality and politics and religion too, with life. The question of Bergson is, if you observe morality and religion in human experience, and you're coming from the creative evolution theory, that is from a theory of life and theory of human knowledge in it, how do you connect the behavior of human beings with the essence of life, with the fact that human beings are living beings? And of course, there are two ways, as I want to sum up again. There are two ways, and no way is rational and epistemological, in effect. For Bergson, human beings as such, and it's of course central for us today in our coming back to our vital condition and what I call vital dilemmas in the title of our discussion today. We are connected to life in two ways. First, it is through the constitution of mankind as a biological species into what Bergson calls closed societies. And because of rareness, scarcity of means, and the limitations of evolution, the evolution has produced closed societies fighting for survival and fighting one against the other. But this is I won't go back to the whole presentation, of course, of the two sources, and
Sure.
but this is our first communication with life. We unconscious, of course, but very, very deep, and it is our first connection with life. And I will go back to it. It's so deep that in fact it acts like a quasi instinct, says Bergson. In the first book, Creative Evolution, first book on this question, he opposes human intelligence to instinct, but in the second book he says that the force of closed society is so strong that it's a quasi instinct. So the question of this is very strong, of course, and this of course is a problem for us today, because if Bergson is true, is and it's his main problem in the two sources, is how any kind of knowledge, the knowledge of, for example, our link with the human, with the life and the cosmos, the knowledge of the destruction of the planet, the knowledge of the risk we are dealing. For Bergson, there is no knowledge that will be strong enough to oppose a quasi instinct. In mankind having to survive in the short term, having to survive in a short space, in a short term, and in a short and a local context, and in opposition with others fighting for the same things of survival in a way. So this is a very pessimistic vision, but it's of course very, very interesting to bring it back today. And then, of course, there is the second contact with life, which is the contact which allows for open morality and open politics and open religion. And this second contact is a personal contact of some human beings with the movement of life in general, as a creation and as a going beyond the closeness of natural society. So that's interesting because, of course, this contact is also unconscious, but it is a contact that maybe is immediate and is a contact with what is the contact you want to produce. I mean, how does a human being today realize that we are part of the living creation, that we have to go to protect it and to go beyond it? And it's of course for Bergson, it's the great man of good, the great the mystic, calling for universal justice, and trying to deliver mankind from suffering, and trying to go beyond mankind, to protect also animal, plants, and the universe. And Bergson says it goes, of course, beyond mankind, because the in all meanings of the expression, because the open society, open morality has to go beyond mankind. It has to go beyond mankind to be effective, and it has to go beyond mankind because it opens beyond mankind. He wants to protect the planet. And he even says the planet. The word planet appears in the book when Bergson says that the open hero, the open morality hero says, I extend my love to the whole planet, and I would, and then also for the sake of one injustice, I would better sacrifice the planet. So there is the word planet at some strategic point in the book. So that's the two ways. But then there is this very interesting fourth chapter. Sorry for the
That's very good.
Sorry for the
great.
coming back.
It's great for me. Yeah.
So there is this fourth chapter when Bergson says, okay, mysticism is absolute, but it is not. It's absolute in its principle, but it's not absolute in its effect, and we lack some open witnesses of life. And so what should we do in the meanwhile? What should we do in the meanwhile? And as you well know, for all of the Bergsonian scholars here today, and the participants, and the people watching us too, I think it's that what Bergson says is, well, we have to find a grip on the issues, that even if we are not mystics, because the mystic is rare, even if we are not ready to connect to life directly. And what is and so that's where he has a diagnosis on what he calls the present time and the age of what he calls the machine. And in fact, what he says is that, okay, if we cannot appeal to the vital force that's the only one really able to oppose the quasi instinct of war, what we have is the current state of affairs, and that's globalization. And that's globalization, and that's the fact that technique and commerce has unified the planet with many dangers, and instead of calling to the mystical elan, what we have as a substitute, as a second choice solution, is to regulate the global planetary forces, because otherwise it will be destroyed. And Bergson even speaks of the possibility that we develop a weapon that will destroy the planet. Not only exterminate the enemy, but destroy the planet. So what's very interesting to me, I wanted to summarize the two movements. It's that the chiasm, so to speak, between Dipesh movement and Bergson's movement. It's a little bit artificial, but it's for the sake of the discussion. In a way, Dipesh starts with the global as the human conflicts on the planet and the call for justice to go beyond the global injustices that have been structuring world history up to now, with the colonial dissymmetry, with the military, the exploitation of men around the planet, and so forth. And you went from the global to the planetary and to life. And Bergson, in a way, does the reverse. He goes from the life to the planetary and then to the global. That is, in fact, recognizing in a way that if we are not totally mystical human beings, we could at least be moved by fear and danger on the one hand, and by the sense of justice on the other hand. So that's why I think there is also a room in the two sources for Hans Jonas, but I think Bergson is in a way, that's my position, deeper than Hans Jonas, who is already, of course, incredibly deep. But because for him, the motive of fear for destruction, and I don't know that actually in your position, Dipesh, the place for fear as an emotion, of course, because Jonas wants to work on the level of fear, what he calls hermeneutics of fear. And of course, fear for destruction is a motive for Bergson, but only a second choice motive. If you are not moved by love, then let us move you by fear. I mean, if you are not moved for the sake of justice and mankind and human and life, then at least please realize there is a danger. Please be afraid. But is it enough? Well, it's interesting because in the great hermeneutics of global history, we don't have so many possibilities, of course. We have the hermeneutics of reason. We can act through reason. And I think you are a great contemporary rationalist in a way, and hoping that it will be enough to know the dangers and to know what we are and to know our being, to act. But there is the hermeneutics of emotion, and this is hermeneutics of emotion. You have the negative side of fear and the positive side of love, in a way, love or open or the calling to a greater future, in a way, to an emancipation, so to speak, in a political sense. And of course, I think Bergson speaks of fear as a second choice global motive, in a way. And there you have Jonas located into the fourth chapter of Bergson's book. And then there is also this, so it's very interesting because in a way, Bergson is not so optimistic that being part of life will be enough for us to realize, to act for life. Being part of it doesn't make us automatically acting for it. The question, it's taking life in the very sense that you're taking it. Life is the concrete evolution on the planet. It's the link between all the living beings in this planet. That's life. Life is not a concept, and life is not a property, abstract. Life is the concrete fact we all share, but that's not enough to make us act. The paradoxical result of life is that we are not interested in life because we are interested in our lives. and that's why also in very, very seldom passages where Bergson speaks of health and in the Evolution Créatrice, he says that we are interested in technique, in matter, and not in life. That's why we are interested in geometry and not in medicine and hygiene, for example. We don't wash our hands. It's more interesting for us to build theorems than to wash our hands. And well, let's put that away. So what I want the last point I want to make is that it's to build a sort of third position beyond Dipesh and Bergson's position in the discussion maybe we can have today. And of course it's too much to say, but it's just to set up the things. And the position is that, of course, I said that there was also the question of justice and injustice. And I think, in fact, what is in common between global and planetary history? What do they have in common? Both in so to speak, we're between us in a way, that both in Bergsons and in Chakrabarty. Okay, what do these two history have in common? It's a moral question. So it's not as if the moral and political question was secondary to the history, but in fact, what it's in common is that global history, as a history of mankind and its wars and the economic communication and the technique and globalization, on the one hand, and planetary history, it's a matter of life and death in a way. It's a matter of our responsibility as far as it is called up by a polarity between life and death, between danger and opportunity, between danger and answering the danger. And so I think there is a third position. And the third position, to me, and we discussed that 2 days ago with Dipesh, and that's what we wanted to share with you today. To me, the question is, where does this feeling of injustice come from in the human life? Where does the feeling of injustice come from? Does it come from a global history, political point of view? Does it come from a relationship to life in general? Does it come from a mystic uprising, so to speak? And to me, that's not where it comes from. It comes from the interaction of individual human lives in our vital relationships. It comes from the breakup, what I call the violation of the vital links between human beings, the internal polarity that makes that our loving links are also permeated with hatred, that war exists, but as opposed to peace and as opposed to the construction of the world. So I think that between the global and let's rather say between the history of life and the global, between planetary history and global history, there is the realm, so to speak, of vital and moral relationship between human beings. And for me, of course, and that's where I am a sort of humanist reader of Bergson now. I mean, for a Bergsonian, vital humanism is a contradiction, of course. Huh? Bergson is no humanist. Bergson is not either a transhumanist, of course. Bergson says that we have to go beyond mankind, but it's not to add some technological faculty to the existing human beings. It's to go beyond the moral limitations of mankind. It's not to go beyond the technical limits of mankind with the same moral apparatus. It's to go beyond the moral apparatus of mankind, which is very different. There are many ways to pretend to go beyond mankind. Okay, but the thing is, I am more of a vital humanist, because being a vital humanist means that you could maybe show that to reach for to answer and also to explain the vital dilemmas that we face. We don't need to go beyond mankind. On the contrary, you go inside mankind as a vital species, inside mankind with vital relationships. And that's the way you come back to the feeling of injustice in both in global and planetary history. So we are outscaled, because these are huge histories, the history of slavery and colonialism on the one hand, for example, and the story of the life and today the acceleration of the destruction. This is this is dizzying for us. This is giving us some sense of disproportion, and you are a thinker of that disproportion, just as Gunther Anders, who says that we have built something beyond human, and we are now in front of a sort of a disproportionate challenge, and how do we face it? But it's true and it's not true, because of course we can build institutions that and we can build the feeling of this disproportion is itself in the human relationship. So the feeling of the disproportion is still human. And where does this feeling come from? It's a feeling of injustice in a way. So if we can build on the fact that every huge injustice is related to the smaller ones, to the injustices at the scale of the human beings, and so I think to sum it up, I think Dipesh's work show us, and I think that is why it's a great opportunity today, and I'm very curious of how the people here will react to our discussion, and our friends. I'm so happy to see the faces and the ones I don't see too. I'm very curious of the reactions, because I think Dipesh's view remind us that Bergson's questions are still relevant in a way. He was, of course, one of the first to put human questions in vital terms, and he was very much criticized for it. Because how do you put? He was writing in a time, and I close with my introductory remarks. He was writing at a time where, of course, human history was emancipating itself from vital history, for the better or worse, with the emancipation by technique and the destruction of the world by technique, the weapons. But it was still a sort of, emancipation from nature in a way, and he was, of course, denying that. We are a part of life, and of course this was misunderstood at the time. It was either understood as a reductionism or as a purely enthusiasm of mysticity. What I think is, in fact, the problem is coming back to us. What do we do with this connection? What do we do with this vital connection? And we are taken in concrete vital dilemmas. What I think we need is we need to connect global and planetary history to concrete ethical and political choices. And if we don't do that, we need the large scale, but we need also the alternatives. And the alternatives comes from within human action and human societies, and of course that's where we are. So we have we have a few options, but the emergency, of course, is here, and we can see in Philadelphia today. I mean, in Pennsylvania today, of course, how the global challenges can be on the razor's edge, on the very small and debates between in some human societies. So this is an interesting thing, because I think what happens in the US today there is a concept that Dipesh doesn't use much, the concept of the cosmic. You have the planet, you have the planetary, you have the global. For me, what happens in the US today is of a cosmic importance, and cosmic, I mean, cosmic is both human and vital. It's neither the global nor the planetary. I think it's what's of it includes the feeling that our fate is linked to it. That's what's the cosmic. Kant distinguishes between the scholasticus and the cosmicus concept of the philosopher. The scholasticus is only building a theory, and the cosmicus is inserting his theory in the practice, in life, and in the world. And of course, Kant himself, as a few noticed, Kant is a cosmical philosopher in his view, And you are a cosmical philosopher too, and so is Bergson. So I think this call for global Bergsonism is to have also a sort of cosmic philosophy. So this
Great.
is what I wanted to sketch, and Len, if you want to well, that was the first step of our discussion, but maybe we can, I don't know if you want Dipesh to answer or Dipesh wants to answer, or we open the floor immediately. It's
I
up
would
to
think if Dipesh would
Yeah.
have some response, that'd be great.
Okay.
And then we can open the floor to everyone that's in attendance. So go ahead, Dipesh.
So maybe I'll just make some quick points. First of all, thank you, Frédéric, for your characteristically generous remarks, but also characteristically teacherly remarks on Bergson, which really helped me. So you actually made Bergson global and relevant, no question. I also thought that the connection you made between things being disproportionate and our sense of justice was a fascinating connection, because really you're actually connecting justice to scale, justice to things being commensurate. So this idea of measurement and mensuration as part of a human notion of justice, I think that's a fascinating connection. It would be worth following up on it. But very quickly, I'll just have some quick responses to some of the things you said about fear and fear as motivation. So some of the geologists I read actually say that the problem's been that human beings have lost, modern human beings have lost all sense of fear as a value, not fear as an instinct. I mean, you might be still fearful to be in the dark, alone, or whatever. That's instinct. But you know, and when I read that, I sort of went back to Adorno and Horkheimer's, and the book on enlightenment begins by saying that that enlightenment was fundamentally about helping human beings to overcome fear. So in a way, overcoming fear at many different levels has been such a pervasive theme of modernity that it's actually worth discussing if there is a need to bring back, alongside our sense of wonderment at nature, a sense of reverence as well. Because reverence would mean a kind of a combination of respect with awe, or some kind of fear. So I thought that fear is a very interesting point. In many ways, I think where I would sort of slightly want to modify what you talk about action, my thinking is not so much about how do we act, because I think human beings are at a situation where human beings will act, but no action taken by itself will be sufficient, because there are multiple. So human beings are facing a plethora of problems, which in policy science would be described as a wicked problem. A wicked problem is a complex of problems. So a wicked problem is a problem you can diagnose. You understand why the problem is happening, but it has so many dimensions to it that you don't have one single window in which to address all its dimensions. So you might be able to address global warming, the question of temperature per se, but miss out on biodiversity, right? So as there's an article in in today's one of the scientific papers that I follow, which was arguing that even if we were able to bring down the temperature, the very technology of food production might still push up the temperature. So I'm just saying, so in some ways, I think human beings are facing a predicament of a kind they've never faced before. And it's multidimensional. So partly my thinking is actually addressed to understand, to help us deepen our understanding of the predicament. Because what happens is, because the problem is urgent, see, when a problem is urgent, it makes you take shortcuts in thinking, because you're too anxious to address it. And sometimes in your hurry to address it, you take that aspect of the problem which you can address and then make it stand for the whole problem, right? So, and there, even if we were to act, what I learned from Carl Schmitt, as I was mentioning to you, and I think that that sense is there in Hannah Arendt too, is that where Carl Schmitt says in the concept of the political, that humans constitute a pluriverse, not a universe. So in a sense, there will always be disagreements between humans as to what we should do. And I don't see any alternative to that. I think whatever we do, as you see in the American, so many countries are divided today, including this nation. I mean, disagreement is at the forefront of politics in India, in US, particularly with the rise of different kinds of authoritarian regimes everywhere. In Poland, I was speaking to a Polish friend. So I think this question of pluriverse is going to remain important. And third thing I wanted to say was that this is why I think it was a predicament, but it also bears on something that Bergson was very interested in, the question of time. And this is the problem that you see, now that we understand how the planetary climate system works, we know that there are areas in the planet which really should be something like on the UN list of heritage, where no government can change it, because they're of critical importance to many human beings. So one example would be the Himalayan glaciers, because the Himalayan glaciers feed people of 8 or 9 countries. But all the glaciers are divided up nationally. And these nations, which all are serviced by the glaciers and rivers coming out of the glaciers, have no agreement between them, a multilateral agreement. Whereas the glaciers need kind of a global governance or global regulation. Similarly, the Siberian permafrost. Similarly, the North Atlantic conveyor belt, this movement of water from North Atlantic, which has a critical role to play in maintaining climate. What happens inside the sea where human beings don't live? So there's an emergent need for global regulation of many problems. But the instrument we have is United Nations, where nations exercise their autonomy, and the US government has just decided to walk out of the Paris climate deal. Going back to the question of the pluriverse. And in some ways, we don't have an institutional adequacy for meeting the challenge. And the one simple way to bring it back to the question of time is that in normal global politics, through the United Nations, you assume that there is an indefinite amount of time at the disposal of humans. So you ask anybody, how long will it take for the Palestinians and the Israelis to solve their problems? People will say, as long as it takes. You go back to the IPCC is always giving you a definite calendar of action. It will say, if you don't act by this time, this thing will happen. And we don't have institutions that can actually produce synchronized actions on those planetary calendars. So that brings us back to the question of time and temporality. So in some ways, the idea of time with which we built up the United Nations and thought global politics is very different from the idea of time, historical time, we are called upon to think and act on when you actually read the reports of the IPCC on climate change. So I just want to make those quick comments. So mainly to say that, I think I'm addressing a predicament rather than an agenda for action. I mean, there are many agendas for action, including some ones I don't like geoengineering. So there are multiple actions on which we will fundamentally disagree. And I don't see any other way but to work through the disagreements to the degree possible. And there are some disagreements you can't work through, you simply work through the consequences of them. Anyway, they're very quick responses to you, but I'd be happy to open up.
Thank you both. A really great start to the conference here. Frédéric, do you want to make a short reply, or would you rather go to the audience?
No, I think it's good that we open, and then I will take up Dipesh's questions with some other as they rise,
Okay.
of course.
Okay, well then we can, we have a lot of time for questions, almost 40 minutes. So anyone who wants to pose a question or make a comment should feel free, and I can promote you to panelists, which allow the speakers to actually see you as well. So just either through chat or raising your hand, let me know if you want to make a comment.
There was one on the chat, Len, that you
Yeah.
asked was, I think, Chris Poole.
Yeah, Chris Poole, would you like to make a comment?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. It was just, I guess, something I was reading today in Creative Evolution, and I'm not sure if I've got this right, but Bergson was implying that life does not proceed by addition and adding on to, but by, I guess, division and divergence. And it kind of struck me as, it sounds very kind of, you know, nothing gets kind of resolved, but it just kind of splits off, which I think I just wonder if that has some sort of bearing on this discussion of just how we might sort of go about dealing with this kind of these biological problems. But apart from that initial just remembering, but yeah, that's just come to mind. If there's any thoughts about that particular section.
Chris, just a point of clarification. So is that dissociation like, would you compare it to something like what biologists call speciation, the emergence of a new species?
In a certain sense, yeah. I mean, I guess Bergson meant it like, well, if there's an internal conflict, it tends to split apart, as in that biological sense. So yeah, or that sort of genesis of something new out of what cannot sort of exist together. I can't remember the exact context, so I apologize for that, but yeah.
I think if I can maybe give a word of answer and commentary, and it brings back to Dipesh question too. Yeah, I think Bergson shows that life at the beginning was a global impetus in a way, and then it was split by the encounter with matter on Earth, and it divided into species with themselves into directions first. I mean, that's his reading. I mean, not only species. It's a little bit more complicated. It's the plant. It takes more like the Aristotle division. It's the plant, the animal, and the human. And then the human again split themselves into societies and individuals. And then the question is, and there is another thinker who thinks it this way, and I think it's interesting to compare in a way. It's the question is, once you have this division, how do you get back to the whole, as you just said? And there are two ways. For Bergson, there are the remains of the whole in every part, but it's divided. But then precisely the best way to go back to the whole is the mystic action, which in fact goes beyond the division of human beings and the division of the humanity from the rest of life. So going back beyond the division needs a huge effort according to Bergson. But there is a comparable analysis in Freud, actually, in the Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920, where Freud says that individuation is the effect of the limitation of life, and we tend to go back to unity through two ways: to the death instinct, of course, which is a way to go away with our individuality, and also with love and sexuality. And sex is love is for eros is for Freud's a way to reunite beyond division. To have a contact with the unity of life and the diversity too. And there is even this speculation at the end of a Beyond Pleasure Principle, where Freud says that he goes back to the banquet in Plato, and the fact that male and female are looking together to be reunited. So the aspiration beyond sexuality and love is an aspiration toward unification as opposed to destruction, and that's for Freud in a way. It's a way to go beyond his belief. His first belief was to be beyond war and death. It's science, but then there is this appeal to life instinct, life drive. And well, I don't want to introduce psychoanalysis here, but I think it's quite important to understand that that if indeed division in a biological sense and division in a political sense, it's not the same, of course. And but still they call for a kind of a drive to overcome it. I think what I agree with in Carl Schmitt's view of the political is that the political is intrinsically divided, of course. And that's also the view, for example, for those who know him, in Claude Lefort's theory of democracy as a space for dealing with social divisions. But the thing is, it's one thing to call a division in a democratic space. For example, you have divisions. We disagree. Okay, disagreement is one thing. But Carl Schmitt is go much farther. It not speaks of division. It speaks of enmity.
Right.
And so he makes divisions unsurmountable. It's the essence of our being that's opposed to the essence of the other. It's not that we share a unity and we disagree on major points and maybe vital questions.
Vital disagreements, yeah.
But it's different because for Schmitt, the politics is war in its essence, because the enmity is the war is the reality of division, and there you have a major conceptual choice to make. Is every division a war, or is war only one instance of division, and that you can bring back to a discussion so this is a very important thing, of course, and that's where to me in our vital relationships we encounter division, we encounter hatred, we encounter war, but we encounter it within a relationship, and that's where the political is not reducible to war to me.
Great, thank you. So Alia has a question as well.
Hi, Frédéric and Dipesh. It's wonderful to meet you. I've admired your work for a long time. So I have a question about relationality. So, and this is Frédéric's third way, I think, the vital moral relations between human beings that would be on a different kind of scale. And so I think this is a question for both of you. So I'm just going to try and I'm not sure, I'll try and articulate it as best I can. So I'm very interested in this question of change of scale that Frédéric was reading into Dipesh's work and finding there. I think that's a really interesting sort of relationship, but also difference in what you were presenting. And I'm interested in the way in which the histories of colonialism and slavery will work out to be a non-relationality. So to actually be a cut. So as some thinkers of the Middle Passage would put it, or of slavery, that it is a rupture and not, or a breach and not a relationality at all. And so whatever we have afterwards on a global scale will be something that is already marked by this and grounded in it. And hence will actually feature quite deep non-relationalities that would take, redress and justice to recreate, right, relationality, but we can't assume it as a given anymore, or we can't assume it as a given this particular, given our, given that we live in the afterlives of slavery and in the afterlife and in a colonial settler context. So what I'm wondering is how the move, I guess it's for both of you, because I saw more of the disproportion and when we're talking about the geophysical and all of that, that there's a kind of way in which it breaks up human relationalities in a way, right? It's a disruptive element as well. But I was wondering how Frédéric's third position then, that kind of comes back to the human, right? Comes back to humanism, would be able to handle these disproportionalities if what we're relying on is no longer vital moral relations that we can take to be, that our subjective relations are relational at all, that maybe we're actually, in some ways, think that we're dealing with each other in a relational way, but we actually are living in quite different worlds, which feels more and more the case anyway. And that well, I think it always felt like that, but anyway, it's yeah. So I hope that's clear as a question. So I think it's a bit of a provocation, the question, but I think I think it's interesting to think about these questions of relationality and non-relationality in light of these moves of scale that you're both making.
So Frédéric, do you want to, okay. You want to go? Okay, I'll just very quickly. No, I think Ali, that's a great question. Now, so first of all, when I look at the history of empires and colonialism, it's very clear that the kind of colonial rule that my people endured in India was very different from the kind of colonial rule that the Australian Aboriginals had to put up with in Australia or Native Americans, in India, they produced a university-educated middle class, and therefore there's a very different relationship to Europe. Whereas I totally agree with it, whereas the experience of being enslaved in the Atlantic slavery history is a very different one. But I go back to something that Sartre said in the preface he wrote to Fanov's Wretched of the Earth. And he's making a point that Hegel makes in Phenomenology, where he's saying that there is a perverse recognition of another person as a human being when you make a slave out of them. Because you only make a slave out of another human being. You don't make a slave out of, your cow or your dog or your bird. So there is a peculiar, in other words, you can humiliate a human being much more than you can humiliate an animal. I mean, you can humiliate an animal, but this, even when we look about the problem of untouchability in India, the caste problem, a lot of it actually is about everyday politics of humiliating somebody as you incorporate them into the social bond. So I would say, yes, of course, there's a break and there's a rupture, there's no question, but there's a peculiar relationality in there. As Sartre makes this point, that there's a peculiar form of recognition, which is almost at the level of the species. So if you read European narratives of European sudden arrival on Pacific shores or Australian shores, you realize that they actually ask an Aboriginal person for directions for water, even when there's no linguistic communication, right? Because there's a fundamental recognition of another person as a human being. And in that recognition is grounded the oppression, the exclusion, and the enslavement that can then begin. Just want to make that point quickly. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, very briefly, because I see there are other questions, but this is a great question, of course. To me, it's very coherent because to me, global history is precisely a way to go beyond the global separations and global exclusions. It's not by hazard, it's not by chance that global history built itself on the problems of colonialism and slavery, for example. It's in the essence of it. Now you can have global history of anything. Maybe you will have, and it's the point with all major epistemological turn. I mean it can be applied to anything. But why did it start with major reparations, as you put it yourself? I mean, I think it's because it's one of the ways to go beyond what is probably felt as an injustice progressively. And I think that's why you have to start with the feeling of injustice. And just to quote Bergson, not to quote, but to evoke Bergson again, I think, when he says, the feeling of injustice has to arise for the injustice to be seen, and in a way, some historians help us to see a global injustice, and now we tend to admit it, and the sign that it's working in the Hegelian way, in the spirit, the objective spirit of the time, is that it's even rejected very violently in France and in the US and so forth, but some part, because it's very challenging, and it's so I think the repair of the breakup are really the essence of the global project, just as the repair of the breakup between human and animal and living beings are the essence of the planetary thing. So it's not very Bergsonian, because for Bergson we have an intuitive and immediate access to unity, but for us maybe today we go to unity through and against separations and violations.
Great, thank you both. We now have a queue. Emile, you're next, and then Rob at Penn State, and then Rob Watt is number 3. So go ahead, Emile.
Okay, thank you. I hope you are getting me over there. I'm Emile from Yaoundé, Cameroon, Africa. I thank the both speakers for their thought and their presentation. I have a short preoccupation. What is the place of the creation in your two positions concerning the history of life? Because it doesn't seem to me that Bergson dealt practically with this question. That's all, please. I'm true.
No. It's very important. Maybe it's for me to answer first very quickly. Yeah, I think to me, of course, the opposition between creation and destruction is the essence of life. Of course, the only thing is that is creation a sort of does it to be a human creator as against destruction? Do you have to go beyond mankind? That's where I personally I stop now. But of course, the polarity between creation and destruction is to me the great invention of Bergson metaphysically, to interpret life and death not only as not as a what I call the substantialist vitalism of an essence of life and an essence of matter or inert, but of course it's the opposition between creation and destruction. So the opposite of destruction is never the statu quo, of course, and that's where the question of time comes back. And thank you, Emile, because it's very central, of course. But I didn't want I didn't have time to dwell on it. But of course, the great mystic is a creator. But to me, even if the creator, Bergson also says that the great mystic creates institutions. So the United Nations that Dipesh is so critical of, and is right, of course, but for Bergson in 32, the people who created the Society of Nations were great mystics, and Saint Francis created an order and so forth. So I think these kind of creations are, of course, the only way to oppose destruction.
Okay, thank you.
And then Rob.
All right. First of all, thank you very much, both of you, for speaking. It's wonderful to actually meet you. My question relates, I'm trying to actually tie Dipesh's comments on the difference between the IPCC and the UN in terms of how they conceive of time. And what I'm thinking of is, of course, the very Bergsonian notion of our concepts, our schemata, and specifically our schemata of time, and how the past, this past, especially for Merleau-Pontians, this past that has never been present, it goes along the present and shapes it. And I'm aware that this work is already present in, let's say, the work of Ted Toadvine, where how we think of the natural past shapes our notions of, the acceleration of climate change and things like that. I'm also aware of Alia's work on, colonialism and colonialist past and decolonial past. So my question is something like, which has a better, I know this is flattening things out, but which would you say has a better conception of the past, the globe or the global history, or the history of the planet? So, yeah, thanks.
Can I take a stab at this one? Rob, thank you for your question. And it won't be a Bergsonian answer, but it's the way that I've been thinking about it. So maybe it'll connect up with Bergson somewhere. So the history of the planet in many ways is about deep history and how it comes into our life, as distinct from recorded history, which is the histories we normally produce in history departments, or even sometimes in archaeology departments, right? And what happens is that deep history runs through us. So in a way, you're never outside of deep history. The fact that your brain can think so many things is actually due to the history of the evolution of the brain. Though you are in your case the possessor of that instrument. But you haven't fashioned the instrument. The instrument wasn't designed at your birth. The instrument had been designed over many, millions of years, from hominin brain to our brain. And that brain allows you to do something. The fact that you can pick up a glass or a cup like this is because we have this opposable thumb, right? Now, this is how deep history is all around you. What the planetary crisis does for historians, for many of us, is to suddenly make deep history come to the forefront of our consciousness. Normally, we take it for granted. So normally, it's to go back to Merleau-Ponty, normally you have a corporeal schema you don't think about. Like when you go to sleep or when you're walking around, you're not bothered by the fact that you have a back you can't see. But you have a back, you know that, right? So deep history normally is something you take for granted. You don't think about it. And but when a crisis happens, it becomes visible because you're actually affecting futures at a deep historical level. So if you're fending off the next ice age, you're actually acting on a deep historical level. So in his book on uncertainty, Wittgenstein has this wonderful question. He says, when human beings look at a building, they ask, how old is it? Why don't we ask this question of mountains? Now, we normally don't, because the mountain is part of the givenness of the world for human beings. But today in the Himalayas, at least in the Indian part of the Himalayas, there are so many landslides because of climate, erratic weather, cloudbursts and everything. And there are so many dams being built on seismic zones that newspapers talk about the fact that the Himalayas are a young mountain and therefore very active inside. And there are a lot of volcanic activities going on because of the age of that mountain. Now, normally, an Indian citizen wouldn't have to think about it. But the question of the life of the Himalayas has become a question for non-specialists who think about the environment, right? So that's how I'm saying deep history comes to the fore. So planetary history is something that you suddenly have to deal with, whereas before, I would have simply taken it for granted and left it to geologists, or evolutionary biologists to think about deep history.
Thank you. And then Rob Watt, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. There are plenty of ethicists, very practically minded ethicists these days, who will argue that we human beings ought to adopt a more global perspective, where that involves drawing less of a line between human beings and other living beings in our ethical lives. And I suppose I think of some of those philosophers as arguing, not only that if you have that kind of global perspective, one thing you should do is stop eating other animals, and some of them even go so far as to say we should be global, police officers and stop other animals eating each other. And I suppose my question is, does that strike you as a should I be thinking of these philosophers as adopting a good Bergsonian global perspective, or are there sort of important differences, do you think, between this kind of global perspective and one that's more Bergsonian?
Frédéric.
Well, thank you. I think it's interesting, your question. I think it brings back the question of the responsibility of human beings as such. And of course, extending to the world, but the good and bad extension is a very interesting question. Of course, everyone has to have a personal behavior, and I think it has to be connected today with global issues. I think one interesting thing today is that for some vegetarians, there is the classical ethical argument dating back to the antiquity that the relationship between a human being and animal and so forth. But there is a new argument, which is very interesting, of course, is that when you eat some flesh of animals, you destroy the planet. You destroy the planet because it costs a lot to be produced, because it is produced in an industrial way, because and so forth. And to me, well, I didn't decide to become a vegetarian, but I think it's a very interesting argument, and I think that's why I try not to be very selective on and to criticize the industry and so forth. And I think. And I think it's a very central issue to the way you extend responsibility, and of course you can extend your own responsibility to your behavior towards animals. You know that Plutarch tried to not eat insects even involuntarily, because there is so he tries to, well, and then you have to extend the protection to the global dangers. Which, as Dipesh said, are a danger to non-human living beings. That's a responsibility. That's for sure to me. Then the other example you say, I mean, intervening in the life of other living beings is, to me, as you put it. I mean, I don't know if there are such arguments. They are a sign of the times. I mean, it's a symptom of our common problem. They should be addressed. Why not? But to me, they are not the good way to extend our responsibility to global. So I think what you say is a confirmation of the problem, at least. The way we behave toward the environment is, of course, one of the signs of our awareness, a growing awareness of our vital condition. But then there has to be a debate. And I think what's the real global danger? How do we address it? I think, of course, we help more animals by preventing major fires and the climate change than we would do by other ways. But then the industry of food and then there are the age-old ethical questions. But Plutarch, or I don't know, Montaigne, they didn't have in view the global destruction of the biodiversity and so forth. Even though Montaigne did have some views on that.
If I can come in on it, Rob, great question. I was just thinking, there's a couple of things. One is that it seems to me that one principle that is coming to the fore in all kinds of discussions is that of scaling back. And to what degree you scale back, what entity, it's one decision for a gas company to scale back. It's another decision for a consumer to scale back on, consumption of electricity or meat or whatever. But I think scaling back is a question that's becoming important. But I also wanted to say that something Frédéric was talking about, Bergson following Aristotelian kind of classification of, animals, plants, and humans. And of course, what we realize now that the majority form of life, both by weight and numbers on the planet, are microbial, right? Humans are a minority form of life, but acting in a majoritarian way. So I kind of think it's like, it's like sort of white settlers in a black majority country acting in a majoritarian way, like as though this thing was made for us and we decide what to do. And therefore, I think humans have to evolve what I think of as minority forms of thinking, because we are a minority form of life. But at the same time, the trouble is, of course, there's a question of human protection. So I don't think you can be friends with the anthrax virus or with the coronavirus. I mean, even though the microbes are inside us, outside us, and they're the majority forms of life, but sometimes there is enmity. I mean, they want to kill you and you want to live, going back to our own vitalism and the individual lives and the desire to live rather than to die when you don't want to die. Okay, thanks.
Great, thank you. So Saeed, you're next. You have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Thank you very much for both presentations and discussion that they created, and also important questions that they brought to our mind. I just want to, compare the point of Frédéric about the requirement of action in terms of alternative moral and ethical dimensions, and also the comment of Dipesh about the insufficiency of action. This is really a big dilemma that brings a challenge to human solving their problems and bringing integrity with life. In my mind, I think the crucial issue here is the of power. That's by authorities especially, and other, agencies. And here, even in democracies, the authorities, they find, they see right, even further than monarchies. So what will be the role of individual and society in all these disagreements to make some sort of solution for reducing the exercise of power, and then afterwards creating some sort of this kind of diversity and separation among different groups of societies. Is there a way in global and planetary and also life history to find and to impose some sort of new ways, new methods to create a balance for this extreme exercise, use of power, and cause of so many troubles, problems? Thank you.
I had a connection problem at some point, but I think if someone can, I think I understood the question, but maybe Dipesh can answer first.
You were breaking up, Said, as you were speaking, so I didn't get the full question, but I thought you were asking about the relationship between action and the existing structures of power. Mm-hmm. Would that be right?
Can I repeat?
Sure, please. Yeah, please.
Yeah. I was saying that this requirement of action suggested, moral and ethical by Frédéric, and your comment about insufficiency of action, because of so many disagreements and things, is a big kind of challenge, dilemma in human being and societies. But at the same time, I think to solve this issue, one of the main problems is the extreme exercise of power, even in terms of democracies. Some democratic authorities, they tend to use this extreme authority even more than monarchies, more than other systems. So what is the solution, the new method that we can combine this balance of action and also not causing so much pressure on humanity by exercising this power?
Okay, Frédéric will have to speak to the sufficiency of action, and I'll speak to the insufficiency of action. Well, look, at least to me, it's clear that the current form of consumerist capitalism is unviable if you're thinking of prosperity of all human beings, or let's say the flourishing of all human beings. If you look at, so talking about great acceleration, the year in which they said there were 1 billion consumers, that is people who could buy motorcycles, cars, refrigerators in the world, was 1986. To 1986 or 1985, we had 1 billion consumers. So it took us that long. The second billion was there by 2006. 21 years. The third billion was produced in 9 years. And if you look at the consuming classes of the world, around 2000, the bulk of them, like 70–80%, were from Europe, North America, countries you would suspect. Now, the share of European countries and North America in the consuming class is about 30%. The rest of it is Asian, Chinese, Indian, African, other places coming up. So, but the impact on the biosphere, the impact on the environment of this is huge. I mean, there are reports in Indian newspapers about hills going missing because they've been illegally razed to the ground. So there are many ways of thinking about it, but I am personally convinced that this model of economic growth, which is about constant growth, whereby we destroy forests, create pandemics, is unviable for human beings. It's creating dangers for us. It's actually not protecting us. So, but at the same time, there are very powerful agencies at work in this. And how we deal with them, how we actually democratize the world, this is where action should be. And I think Frédéric is suggesting that we should be acting towards making the world more democracy, towards making these people more answerable. But if you look at the world today, most democracies are faced with the rise of authoritarian regimes. Most democracies have become anti-refugees, whereas the climate crisis will produce more refugees. The planetary history tells us that if the sea level goes up, there will be more people looking for a place to live. And we will see the problem with nation state, welfare states trying to build walls, sometimes literally, sometimes, as Frédéric discusses, metaphorically. So I think it's a real question. How do we combine democracy with human flourishing going forward? But to my mind, it's clear that the current model of consumerist capitalism is not the way to do it. But I'll leave it, Frédéric.
Yes, so thanks for this question and discussion. Of course, I will not criticize action because it's the necessary. It's the start and the end of our reflections, of course, and it's the distinction between halfway mysticism and full mysticism in Bergson, that half mystics stop before action, and the complete mystic, of course, acts also, as I said answering Emile, as acts also in creating institutions, and it's very interesting because also there is if you look in the Bergson where the word epidemic or contagious appear, you will see in the two sources that the mysticity is contagious. It's a contagion of action. So that the example and the inspiration is also a way of acting as also instituting and so forth. So, of course, I tend to be more institutional in a way that we need frames for action. We need to create common frames and common grounds and so forth. But it is true too that that there can be also an epidemics of examples and action and so forth, and collective action. It does exist. It does exist. So in a way you have to distinguish levels of action, but it's of course it's of course very important. And what's in action? The question of action is in Bergson and I think in any philosopher, and you would find that in Camus too, the question of action is not only what it transforms in the world, but it's the action of someone, acting in the world, and also acting, that means also showing a universal possibility that we can do something. So that there is the action is a self-proof thing. I mean, so there is no full philosophy without a philosophy of action, in a way. But then the philosophers tend to exemplify one action as a, like Socrates, acceptance of death, as and the free act in Bergson, or the way he interprets the Socrates or Jesus, or the act of the hero. So it's very important today, and also to have a moral criterion for the good action as opposed to the fascination for action as such. And well, again, this is a very, very interesting question, of course. Yeah. But I mean, you have to assume some part of acting in the world.
Thank you. We're virtually out of time, but Deborah Morato would like to ask a question, and then we'll wrap it up after this last question. Okay, let's go ahead, Deborah, please.
Thank you. Can you listen me?
Yep.
Okay. It's a very small comment. I would like to thank you so much. These presentations, they are very, very important, and they touch me very much. I must say that what I understand that we have a global planetary urgence that engages a global history urgence. Then we need urgent actions. And the notion of life is very significant, that it's a notion that must be considered to link the two histories. I understood that the difference about your conceptions is about the ways and the origin of the sentiment of, or the idea of injustice, and the lack of respect of life, in a metaphysical sense included. The problem to me is more clear how the micro can take notice of the macro, and how this taking notice depends on the sentiment or the consciousness of injustice and respect of life. I only would like to say that we, in Brazil nowadays, we see the destruction of the Amazonia is currently proportional to the degree of hate and lack of respect for life in Brazil. What we see now especially is a destroying movement of planetary history and a global history. No concerns at all about the destruction of Amazonia, and the degradation of human relationship of individualities. We have never seen a stronger degree of hate, refuse of dialogue, and lack of solidarity in ordinary life, social networks, politics, and moral discussion. This means family relationships, communities relationships, even at school and universities. We have problems with scientists and human scientists. This means that I think that Frédéric's presentation of what Bergson gives us as instruments, ways of thinking about this link, how to link this historic planet, global history, and planetary history, global history, and the relationship in between individual. We see in Brazil, I would like to say this because we wait a lot of a possible democratic government in the United States, because Amazon is burning in a way we never seen, and I would like to thank you so much at this opening session. It's very, very important to us. Is that? Thank you.
Thank you.